The night of October 8th, 2022, Northern Cyprus. A hotel receptionist freezes, staring at his computer screen. Standing before him is an elderly man with an intellectual face, handing over a Ukrainian passport. But the receptionist remembers this face. 2 years ago, the same guest had stayed here with a Russian document, a different name, a different date of birth. With trembling hands, the employee dials the police. Within an hour, a cordon is drawn around the hotel. The man who had been hunted for 7 years across 4 countries was finally caught. Viktor Panyushin, known in the criminal world as VITYA PAN, overseer of 3 Russian regions, a thief-in-law with influence stretching from Kursk to Belgorod, had no idea that his elementary mistake would mark the end of his freedom, and that by 2025, rumors of his death would begin to circulate. But it all started in the distant city of Almatyevsk. September 13, 1958. In the Tatarstan oil town of Almatyevsk, a boy was born who was destined to become one of the most influential criminal authorities in central Russia. Viktor Mikhailovich Panyushin grew up in an ordinary working-class family. Nothing foreshadowed a criminal career. But at the age of 19, a turning point arrived. His first conviction for theft of state property. The year 1975 became the point of no return. Young Panyushin was sent to a penal colony where he encountered a reality that would completely change the course of his life. Prison became not a punishment for Viktor, but a university. Behind bars, he quickly understood. There were different rules here, different codes, a different hierarchy. His cellmates nicknamed him VITYA PAN. The nickname stuck and would later become his criminal alias. Unlike many young inmates, Panyushin did not grow bitter or turn into a prison thug. On the contrary, he read. He read a great deal. Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, philosophy, psychology. He cultivated connections with influential inmates, studied the thieves' code, learned to resolve conflicts with fairness. The old thieves saw in him the qualities of a future authority figure: composure, level-headedness, and principle. But freedom was short-lived. Right up until the year 2000, Viktor moved from one penal colony to another. Drug trafficking, arms dealing, robbery, extortion, the creation of forged documents. The list of crimes grew. By the age of 42, he had 7 convictions and more than 20 years spent in places of deprivation of liberty behind him. One might think him a man broken by life. But Panyushin used each stretch to strengthen his position in the criminal world. Every imprisonment brought new acquaintances, new connections, new authority. He already knew clearly what he wanted to dedicate his life to. September 2000, the city of Kursk. In one of the safe houses, influential thieves-in-law gather. A shodka is underway, a meeting of crime bosses to resolve important matters. On the agenda, the coronation of a new thief. 42-year-old Viktor Panyushin answers to those assembled. He is tested on his knowledge of the thieves' code, questioned about his biography, past deeds, and behavior in prison. Questions come one after another. Panyushin answers clearly, without haste. He had spent the greater part of his conscious life in the camps, had never broken, never cooperated with the prison administration, and had upheld the code. A vote. Consensus. Viktor Panyushin receives the status of thief-in-law. He is now officially VITYA PAN, overseer of Kursk Oblast with influence over Oryol and Belgorod. A rare case. A thief entrusted with control over such a vast territory. But what does it mean to be a thief-in-law in the 2000s? It is not the romance of the criminal hideouts of Soviet times. It is hard criminal management. VITYA PAN controls the Obshchak, the Thieves' Fund, into which contributions from all criminal enterprises in the region flow. He adjudicates conflicts between bandits and issues rulings that are binding. He appoints polazhentsy, trusted representatives in various cities. In effect, a parallel government. Outwardly, Panyushin bore no resemblance to the bandit stereotype of the 90s. No crimson blazers, no gold chains, no loud brawls in restaurants. A modestly dressed man with an intellectual face, a calm voice, and measured manners. He could spend hours discussing classical literature, quoting philosophers, discoursing on justice and honor. Many who met him for the first time took him for a university lecturer or a doctor. This mask of the intellectual became his primary weapon. Ordinary people came to VITYA PAN, a businessman cheated by his partner, an entrepreneur whose share in a company had been forcibly taken, a man whose large debt was not being repaid. In official courts, such cases dragged on for years. VITYA PAN resolved them in a week. He listened, asked questions, and got to the bottom of the situation. He gave the impression of a fair arbitrator. People left satisfied, never suspecting that behind the scenes his problem solvers employed entirely different methods. While Panyushin conducted intellectual conversations in his office, his fighters were working with debtors in basements. It was precisely this duality that made VITYA PAN particularly dangerous. The victims did not understand who they were dealing with until it was too late. And Panyushin himself remained formally uninvolved. He was simply helping people sort things out. Witnesses saw only a calm intellectual offering wise counsel. The dirty work was done by others. The year 2012 marked the beginning of a new chapter. VITYA PAN decided to expand his sphere of influence and created an organized criminal group. Its membership included trusted men from Kursk and Belgorod. Nikolai Romanov, an enforcer responsible for the muscle work. Yaroslav Sokolov and Titov, his deputies. Goncharov and Shelikova, local representatives. Golovin and Pronin, casino controllers. 19 people in total, a compact but effective structure. Like and subscribe to the channel. In the comments, write what you think of such criminal authorities. Is it worth trusting them to resolve conflicts? What follows will be even more interesting. Don't miss the continuation of this incredible story. The first direction was the gambling business. Despite the official ban, underground casinos in Russia thrived. VITYA PAN's gang rented basement premises in Belgorod, installed slot machines, hired croupiers, and security. Clients were attracted through scouts, taxi drivers, hotel clerks, bar staff at clubs. They operated around the clock in shifts. Monthly revenues ran into the millions of rubles. In parallel, a real estate fraud scheme was launched. The mechanism had been refined to the last detail. A victim was selected, most often an elderly person with an apartment in the city center or an entrepreneur with commercial real estate. An assistant would approach the victim, a charming young man who offered to help sell the property at an attractive price. A preliminary contract was drawn up. But at the last moment, the documents were altered. The real buyer was replaced by a front person, the price was slashed, and the money went not to the seller's account, but into the fraudster's pockets. Legally, everything looked clean. The transaction was formalized, the contract signed. By the time the victim realized the deception, it was too late. Over 5 years, 9 million rubles were stolen this way. Dozens of victims lost apartments, offices, and land plots. But the most terrible crimes were the kidnappings and acts of torture. In the summer of 2016, VITYA PAN came into conflict with another criminal authority known as Kulik. The details of the disagreement remained unknown, but Panyushin decided to find out who was behind the attacks on his business. A kidnapping operation was organized. Kulik was lured out of the city under the pretense of a business meeting. The moment the victim got into the car, he was seized and driven out to a forest near Kursk. There, Nikolai Romanov and 3 other fighters from VITYA PAN's crew were already waiting. The interrogation proceeded with the use of torture. He was beaten with feet and metal bats. They demanded he name those who had ordered the conflict. Panyushin himself directed the operation by phone, giving instructions on which questions to ask and how to apply more pressure. The torture lasted several hours. At some point, Kulik broke and named names. He was beaten once more as a warning and released after swearing to keep silent. For several months, Kulik kept quiet. He was afraid of retaliation. But the injuries were serious and required medical attention. At the hospital, questions were asked about the origin of his wounds. In the end, half a year later, Kulik found the courage to go to the police. His testimony became the key link in the investigation against VITYA PAN's group. In parallel, the investigation uncovered a second kidnapping. A certain businessman owed a substantial sum to people connected with VITYA PAN. He was also kidnapped, held for several days in a basement, beaten, and extorted for the return of the debt with interest. The victim was prepared to give up everything just to stay alive. After the money was paid, he was released, but the psychological trauma remained forever. The gang felt invulnerable. The casinos generated stable income, the real estate schemes were working, and competitors were intimidated. VITYA PAN continued to live the life of a respectable businessman, attending cultural events, charity evenings, maintaining connections with the local elite. Few suspected that this intellectual gentleman was running a brutal criminal machine. But in law enforcement circles, patience had worn thin. Too many complaints, too many victims, too obvious a connection between all the crimes and one person. In 2017, an operational task force was created specifically to target VITYA PAN and his organization. Wiretapping, surveillance, and the planting of undercover agents began. On May 14, 2020, the Investigative Committee of the Russian Federation announced the conclusion of the criminal investigation into 19 members of Viktor Panyushin's criminal group. 12 natives of Kursk and 7 residents of Belgorod were charged under the following articles: creation of a criminal community, organization of illegal gambling, fraud on an especially large scale, kidnapping by a group of persons, and extortion with violence. The evidentiary base had been assembled thoroughly. Witness testimony, recordings of intercepted telephone conversations, and financial documents showing the flow of money from the casinos into the Obshchak. But the main figure, VITYA PAN himself, was absent from the indictment. He had managed to disappear. In the summer of 2017, when the investigation entered its active phase, Viktor Panyushin sensed danger. His informants in law enforcement warned him of imminent arrests, and he made a decision that completely changed his life: to go on the run. The last time VITYA PAN was seen in Russia was in June 2017. Then, he vanished. He was placed on the federal wanted list and then on the international one. Interpol entered Viktor Mikhailovich Panyushin into its database as an especially dangerous criminal. But the trail went cold at the Russian-Ukrainian border. Meanwhile, in Russia, the arrests began. Nikolai Romanov was taken first. He had not managed to escape. Golovin and Pronin had been detained in another criminal case before the operation against VITYA PAN's group even began and were already in custody. Goncharov and Shelikova were arrested later. They were already serving sentences for other crimes. Yaroslav Sokolov and Titov managed to flee together with Pan. They were also placed on the wanted list. The trial of the arrested gang members proceeded without the main defendant. Defense lawyers tried to build their case on the argument that their clients had simply been doing a job without knowing the criminal nature of the organization. But the evidence was irrefutable. The sentences were severe, from 8 to 15 years of deprivation of liberty. Meanwhile, VITYA PAN was settling into a new country. Ukraine became his temporary refuge. How exactly he crossed the border is unknown. Perhaps with forged documents, perhaps through smuggling channels, of which there had always been plenty on the Russian-Ukrainian border. But the fact remains, by the end of 2017, Viktor Panyushin was already on Ukrainian territory. And here begins the most enigmatic part of the story. Somehow, VITYA PAN obtained a Ukrainian passport. Not a temporary refugee certificate, but a full passport of a Ukrainian citizen. But in another name and with a different date of birth. When detained in Cyprus in 2023, Panyushin claimed the document had been issued to him officially under the government Witness Protection Program, with his personal details changed for security purposes. The Witness Protection Program does indeed exist in Ukraine. Its purpose is to ensure the safety of people who testify against criminal structures or corrupt officials. Participants can have their first name, surname, and date of birth changed, receive new documents, and be assisted with relocation and employment. But a logical question arises. What testimony could VITYA PAN have given? Against whom? And why would a man wanted by Interpol for murder and the creation of an organized criminal group receive state protection? Several versions exist. The first. Panyushin genuinely began cooperating with Ukrainian intelligence, passing information about Russian criminal structures operating on Ukrainian territory. In exchange for valuable intelligence, he was granted legal status and protection. The second version. Corruption. For a substantial bribe, officials at the Migration Service registered the documents, retroactively framing it as witness protection. The third version. Connections. The criminal worlds of Russia and Ukraine had been closely intertwined since the 90s, when crime bosses from both countries cooperated actively, ran joint operations, and divided spheres of influence. Over 20 years as a thief in law, Panyushin had undoubtedly established contacts with Ukrainian crime figures. Those connections may have helped him reach the right people in law enforcement and get the documents sorted. But the facts speak for themselves. Between 2019 and 2022, Ukrainian security forces detained Viktor Panyushin 5 times. 5 times. Yet there was an international warrant for his arrest. Russia had filed an official extradition request, and Interpol was demanding his detention and surrender. But each time, he was released. After each detention, a formal check was conducted, a report was filed, and Panyushin walked free. Not one of the detentions led to arrest or the initiation of extradition proceedings. Journalists investigating this story point to the likely corruption of Ukrainian law enforcement officials. VITYA PAN may simply have been buying his freedom. Each detention ended with a fix through a bribe to the right people. Given that he had millions in the obszchak, money for bribery was not a problem. In parallel, Panyushin obtained official refugee status in Ukraine. This gave him additional protection. By law, refugees cannot be extradited to the country from which they fled if they face danger there. VITYA PAN used this status as a shield against Russian justice. Life in Ukraine was relatively quiet. Panyushin kept a low profile, lived modestly, and avoided meetings with local criminal authorities. He stayed in contact with Russia through trusted intermediaries. Management of his remaining operations was taken over by a treasurer known by the telling nickname Andryusha Kibelovo. This man handled the group's finances, kept track of income and expenses, and distributed money from the obszchak. A significant portion of the obszchak reportedly wound up in Andryusha's own pockets. But from Ukraine, there was little VITYA PAN could do to monitor it. Panyushin occasionally traveled to other countries. In 2021, he visited northern Cyprus and stayed at a hotel. At that time, he was using a Russian passport, apparently not yet fully destroyed, or a high-quality forgery. He rested for 2 weeks and returned to Ukraine. Everything went smoothly on that occasion. But in 2022, the situation changed. War broke out in Ukraine. Relations between the two countries were severed entirely. Ukrainian authorities began purging everything connected to Russia, including Russian criminal authorities who had been hiding on Ukrainian territory. By decision of Ukraine's State Migration Service, Viktor Panyushin was stripped of his refugee status. The official reason was not disclosed, but it was evident that the political situation had played a decisive role. Without refugee status, Panyushin lost his legal protection. He could now be arrested and extradited at any moment. Staying in Ukraine had become dangerous. VITYA PAN decided to leave the country. Using the Ukrainian passport bearing another person's name, he flew to northern Cyprus, the partially recognized Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, officially recognized only by Turkey. Migration controls there are looser, checks are less rigorous, and one can get lost among the tourists. In early 2023, Panyushin arrived on the island and checked into the very same hotel where he had stayed 2 years earlier. And here he made his fatal mistake. An experienced criminal who had spent half his life in flight and in prisons underestimated the human factor. The front desk employee processing his check-in recognized the guest. 2 years earlier, that same man had stayed at their hotel, but with a Russian passport and different personal details. Now he had a Ukrainian passport, a different name, a different date of birth. A coincidence? Or something suspicious? The hotel administrator did not make a scene. He processed Panyushin as a normal guest, but after his shift ended, he called the police. He reported a suspicious guest with 2 different passports. The TRNC police began an investigation. They ran the Ukrainian passport through their databases. Clean. But they pulled the hotel's archived records from 2021. There indeed was a record of a guest with the same face, but Russian documents. Discrepant personal details, possibly forged documents. Interpol was then engaged. A facial recognition request was submitted through the system. The database returned a match. Viktor Mikhailovich Panyushin, Russian citizen, wanted for the creation of a criminal community, murder, and extortion. On the international wanted list since 2017. Arrest and extradition recommended. The night of October 8, 2022, the hotel is surrounded. Panyushin is detained right in his room. He offers no resistance. He understands the game is over. He is taken to a TRNC police station. Interrogations begin. VITYA PAN remains composed, answering questions without emotion. Yes, he has 2 passports. No, he has not used the Russian one since 2021. The Ukrainian one was obtained legally under the Witness Protection Program, with his details deliberately changed so he would not be recognized. He is not a criminal, but a victim of political persecution in Russia. But Interpol insists on arrest. Turkish TRNC authorities initiate extradition proceedings. Panyushin is placed in prison to await a decision. And here, the legal delay begins. Northern Cyprus is a partially recognized state, officially recognized only by Turkey. Russia and the TRNC have no direct diplomatic relations. How is extradition to be carried out? Through Turkey. But that requires coordination with Ankara, document processing, and legal procedures. Months pass. Panyushin sits in the TRNC prison, his case is transferred to Turkey, and from there requests go to Russia. Lawyers try to challenge the extradition, file appeals, cite Ukraine's Witness Protection Program and the political motivation behind the prosecution. But Turkey makes its decision to extradite. On December 8, 2023, the Turkish television channel Haberturk reports, Viktor Panyushin will be declared an illegal immigrant, brought to Turkey, and extradited to Russia. The Council of Ministers of the TRNC signed the corresponding decision. Panyushin, who had been in prison since June, would be handed over to his country. December 21, 2023. A plane from Turkey lands at Moscow's Sheremetyevo airport. On board, under the escort of Turkish and Russian security officers, is the 65-year-old Viktor Panyushin. The 7-year chase is over. The thief-in-law, VITYA PAN, overseer of 3 regions, the man who could not be caught across 4 countries, is finally home. At the foot of the gangway, a group of Russian Interior Ministry operatives meets him. The transfer procedure takes a few minutes, signing documents, handing over personal belongings, removing the Turkish handcuffs and replacing them with Russian ones. One of the operatives turns on a camera to record the moment for the record, and asks the question that will become the key evidence in the case. Do you acknowledge yourself to be a thief-in-law? Panyushin looks into the camera. A pause of several seconds. He could have refused to answer, citing his right to remain silent until he could speak with a lawyer, but he replies, "Yes, I acknowledge it." Those 3 words seal his fate. Under Article 210.1 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, acknowledging one's status is direct proof of guilt. There is no need to prove specific crimes, no need to gather complex evidence. The person himself has acknowledged occupying the highest position in the criminal hierarchy. That is sufficient for a conviction. Why did he confess? Psychologists suggest several reasons: exhaustion after long months in prison, the stress of extradition, the realization that punishment was inevitable. Perhaps a thief's pride came into play, not to renounce one's status even in the face of justice. Or perhaps he simply did not understand the legal consequences of his words. He is brought to Kursk, where a criminal case has been awaiting him for several years. He is placed in pretrial detention facility number 1 in a single occupancy cell, given his status and age. A lawyer is appointed, interrogations begin, and investigative procedures are initiated. The investigation resumes with the main defendant now in custody. Charges under Article 210.1 are officially brought, plus additional charges: creation of a criminal community, organization of illegal gambling, fraud, kidnapping, extortion. The combined sentence could be up to 25 years of deprivation of liberty. At his age, this is effectively a life sentence. The lawyers begin constructing a defense. Their strategy? To challenge the airport confession. They argue that Panyushin was in a state of stress, did not understand the meaning of the question, and was misled. The confession was obtained in violation of procedure. There was no lawyer present, no warning of the right to remain silent. The prosecution counters. The video recording clearly shows that Panyushin was of sound mind, understood the question, and answered voluntarily. No violence or threats were applied. The confession is lawful and may be used as evidence. In parallel, additional evidence of his status is gathered. Witnesses from the criminal world are summoned who confirm Panyushin's coronation in 2000. Recordings of intercepted telephone calls are examined in which he is addressed as a thief-in-law. Financial flows are analyzed, the movement of money into the Obshak, and contributions from criminal enterprises. For the other episodes, kidnappings, casinos, fraud, testimony is gathered from victims and accomplices. Kulik gives detailed testimony about the torture in the forest. The businessman describes the extortion. Casino staff describe how the underground halls were run. Victims of real estate fraud provide documentation. If you are interested in such true criminal stories, be sure to subscribe to the channel and leave likes. Write in the comments which other high-profile cases you would like to hear about. Perhaps you are interested in other thieves-in-law or notorious crimes? Your opinion matters to us. The younger generation is choosing different paths: cybercrime, financial fraud, money laundering through cryptocurrency. The days of physical showdowns, thieves' gatherings, and abshaks stuffed in briefcases are things of the past. The future of crime is digital, anonymous, transnational, and VITYA PAN remains in the past, a symbol of an era that has ended, the last of the Mohicans of the thieves' world, one who could not or would not change. His intellectual mask, his education, his cunning, none of it helped against a system that had resolved to put an end to the romanticism of the criminal code. And when, 20 or 30 years from now, historians study the criminal history of Russia in the early 21st century, the name of Viktor Panyushin will inevitably surface. As an example of transformation, as a symbol of the end of an era, as a warning to those who believe the criminal world is eternal. But now, in 2026, he is simply a 66-year-old man in a pre-trial detention cell. He reads Dostoevsky, takes his blood pressure medication, and waits for trial. And perhaps sometimes he thinks about that fatal mistake at the hotel in Cyprus, the one that destroyed all his plans. One mistake, one familiar hotel, one observant employee, and 7 years of flight ended in a single night. Such is the irony of fate. Viktor Panyushin, VITYA PAN, the intellectual thief, the man of paradoxes. His story will end with a court verdict, but the memory of it will endure as a lesson. In the criminal world, as in any other, sooner or later, the bill always comes due. At the time, Panyushin was a free man. He was 33 years old, with a wealth of prison experience and extensive connections in the criminal world behind him. The 90s opened up unprecedented opportunities: privatization, racketeering, drugs, weapons, prostitution. Criminal business was developing rapidly. Thieves-in-law were becoming the de facto rulers of entire regions. But VITYA PAN did not plunge headlong into the chaos as many young bandits of that era did. He acted carefully, selecting his areas of activity. He participated in racketeering not as an enforcer, but as an organizer and arbitrator. When several gangs could not divide their spheres of influence, they would invite him to mediate. He would study the situation, hear out the parties, and issue a ruling based on the thieves' code. And that ruling was carried out, because it carried his authority. In parallel, the convictions kept coming. In the 90s, Panyushin received 2 more stretches for illegal arms trafficking and extortion. But prison was now not a punishment so much as a business trip. In the camps, he solidified connections, resolved important matters that could not be handled on the outside. He met with thieves from other regions, negotiated the division of spheres of influence, and smoothed over conflicts. By the late 90s, VITYA PAN had become a key figure in the criminal world of Central Russia. He was not loud and public like some thieves of that era, did not court media coverage, did not stage theatrical showdowns. He worked quietly, but effectively. And it was precisely for this reason that the decision was made at the 2000 gathering to crown him. The coronation of a thief-in-law is not merely a ceremony. It is a recognition that the person has reached the highest level of the criminal hierarchy. From that point on, he bears responsibility for upholding the thieves' laws on a given territory, controls the obshchak, adjudicates disputes, and represents the interests of the thieves' world in negotiations with authorities and other criminal structures. The gathering took place in a safe house in Kursk. Several recognized thieves-in-law from different regions were present. Panyushin answered their questions for several hours. He was tested on his knowledge of thieves' traditions, questioned about his past, his convictions, his behavior in prison, and his contributions to the obshchak. They determined whether he had cooperated with the authorities, whether he had violated the code, or dishonored himself in prison. VITYA PAN passed the examination flawlessly. The vote was unanimous. He was granted the status of thief-in-law and appointed overseer of Kursk Oblast with authority over Oryol and Belgorod. It was a vast territory with a population of millions, a developed economy, and serious criminal business. The responsibility was enormous. The first years in his new status, Panyushin devoted to bringing order. Kursk Oblast in the early 2000s was a criminal patchwork quilt. Dozens of small gangs, each pulling the blanket its own way. Constant conflicts, periodic standoffs. VITYA PAN began a systematic effort to consolidate the scattered structures under unified control. He operated not through violence but through negotiation. He summoned gang leaders to meetings, explained the advantages of coordinating operations, and proposed clear rules of the game. Who does the racketeering? Who handles the drugs? Who runs the prostitution? Each one his own niche, no overlap. Everyone pays a percentage into the obszczak. In return, they receive protection and arbitration in the event of conflict. Not everyone agreed voluntarily. Some gangs tried to ignore VITYA PAN's authority and continued to operate their own way. Then the hard methods came into play. Uncooperative leaders were warned once. There was no second warning, only consequences. A few demonstrative showdowns quickly cooled the ardor of the recalcitrant. By the mid-2000s, Kursk Oblast was under Panyushin's full control. In parallel, he built connections with the authorities. In the 90s and 2000s, corruption in regional administrations and law enforcement was the norm. VITYA PAN was skilled at finding the right approach to the right people, not through crude bribery, but through subtle work. He helped a bureaucrat solve a problem. That person became indebted to him. He tipped off a policeman about a forthcoming inspection and earned goodwill. He funded a necessary event and gained access. He had connections in the regional administration, in the police, in the prosecutor's office, and even in the FSB. Not at the very highest level, but sufficient to receive advance warning of planned operations, to influence investigations, and to avoid serious trouble. When in 2005 a case was opened against one of his associates, Panyushin arranged, through a contact in the investigating team, for key evidence to go missing. The case fell apart. Yet VITYA PAN never advertised his contacts in government. It would have contradicted the thieves' code. Officially, he was simply a businessman engaged in various activities. Unofficially, everyone knew who he really was. By 2010, Panyushin's financial position was more than comfortable. The obszczak was topped up regularly. Contributions from casinos, drug trafficking, prostitution, racketeering, and fraud schemes. According to law enforcement estimates, tens of millions of rubles passed through his hands annually. A portion went to support imprisoned thieves, a portion covered ongoing operational costs, a portion settled into personal assets. But unlike many criminal authorities, Panyushin did not build mansions or buy expensive cars. He lived modestly in an ordinary apartment and drove an inconspicuous mid-range foreign car. He dressed simply, wore no gold and no designer brands. Outwardly, a typical middle-class representative, indistinguishable from his neighbors. This modesty was part of his strategy. Do not attract attention. Do not invite envy or gossip. Do not create a target for law enforcement. Many thieves-in-law of that era lived extravagantly, wallowed in luxury, and quickly fell under criminal charges for laundering income or tax evasion. VITYA PAN was smarter than that. He invested money into legitimate business through front people, small shops, car washes, cafes, construction firms. Nothing on a large scale so as not to attract the tax inspectorate's attention. The businesses operated at break-even or with minimal profit, but provided legal cover for financial flows. Large sums were transferred abroad through offshore structures. By 2012, when the story of the underground casinos in Belgorod was getting underway, Viktor Panyushin was at the peak of his criminal career. He was 54 years old, with 12 years in the status of thief-in-law behind him, extensive connections, financial stability, and respect in the criminal world. Nothing seems to foreshadow trouble. But it was at precisely this moment that he made a decision which would later prove fatal. He decided to expand his business, create a more formalized structure, and increase revenues. For this, he needed reliable people, a clear organization, and new areas of activity. He gathered 19 trusted fighters and mid-level authorities around him. Nikolai Romanov became his right hand, responsible for enforcement. Yaroslav Sokolov and Titov were deputies, each supervising separate areas. Goncharov, Shelikova, Golovin, and Pronin, each with his or her own sphere of responsibility. The organization was structured along the classic lines of a mafia structure: VITYA PAN at the apex, making strategic decisions, never personally participating in operations. Below him, the inner circle, the heads of each operation. Below them, the enforcers, the rank-and-file fighters. Contact between levels was minimal. Information was passed strictly up and down the chain of command. If an enforcer was arrested, he would know nothing about the leadership. The first major project was the establishment of casinos in Belgorod. Why Belgorod specifically? A city of roughly 400,000 people, a developed economy, proximity to Ukraine, and relatively weak oversight from local law enforcement. An ideal location for an illegal operation. Through front people, a basement space in the city center was rented. Officially, a building materials warehouse. In reality, a casino with 20 slot machines and 3 poker tables. Entry was by invitation only. Security at the door checked every visitor. Inside, croupiers, a cashier, and administrator. Everyone on a salary, plus a percentage of turnover. Operations ran around the clock in shifts. Clients were brought in by taxi drivers, hotel administrators, and barmen at nightclubs, each receiving a commission per client brought in. Stakes were high, winnings substantial, but statistically the casino always came out ahead. In a single month, one hall could generate up to 2 million rubles in net profit. The success of the first casino inspired the opening of a second, then a third. By 2014, 5 underground halls were operating in Belgorod. Combined profit? Approximately 8 to 10 million rubles per month. VITYA PAN never personally visited the casinos. He managed everything through trusted intermediaries. The money flowed into the Obshchak, with a portion retained for business development and a portion divided among the members of the structure. In parallel, the real estate scheme was being developed. The mechanism had been refined to the last detail. First, a victim was selected. An elderly person with an apartment in the city center, or an entrepreneur with commercial real estate in difficult financial straits. Then an assistant would approach the victim, a charming young man presenting himself as a real estate agent or lawyer. The helper would work his way into the victim's confidence, describe a lucrative deal, and promise a quick sale at a good price. The victim signed a preliminary contract and a power of attorney to conduct the transaction. The substitution then began. The real documents were replaced with forgeries, on which the buyer was a front person, and the price was slashed by a factor of several. The transaction was registered, and the money was transferred not to the seller's account, but to the accounts of shell companies, from which it was quickly cashed out. By the time the victim realized the deception, it was too late. Legally, the transaction had been correctly processed, and all signatures were in place. Proving fraud was extremely difficult. Handwriting forensics were required, evidence of document substitution, witness testimony. Most victims simply gave up, recognizing the futility of fighting back. Over 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, real estate was stolen in this way to a total value of approximately 9 million rubles. Apartments were quickly resold through front people, and the money went into the obshchak. The victims were left with nothing, and finding the real organizers was practically impossible. A chain of front people, shell companies, and forged documents. But the serious trouble came not from the casinos or the real estate fraud. It came from the kidnappings and torture. These were isolated incidents, but they were precisely what drew serious attention from law enforcement and ultimately brought down the entire organization. Summer 2015. VITYA PAN comes into conflict with a criminal authority known as Kulik. The details of the disagreement remain unknown even to investigators, but it involved serious money and spheres of influence. Kulik controlled part of the drug trade in Kursk Oblast, and, according to Panyushin's information, had begun targeting his people, demanding a renegotiation of territorial boundaries. VITYA PAN decided to deal with the matter radically. He needed to find out who was behind Kulik, who supported him, and whether there were patrons among other crime bosses. That required a serious conversation. Nikolai Romanov received the assignment to organize the kidnapping. The plan was drawn up carefully. Kulik was lured out under the pretext of a business meeting. Ostensibly, a businessman wanted to discuss a major deal and needed an arbitrator. Kulik agreed, suspecting nothing. The meeting was scheduled at a cafe on the outskirts of Kursk. Kulik arrived alone, as agreed. The moment he got into the car with Romanov's men, he was seized. His mouth was sealed with tape, a bag pulled over his head, and he was driven out of the city. A prearranged location, an abandoned cowshed in the forest, far from roads and populated areas. Romanov and 3 other fighters were already waiting there. Kulik was tied to a chair. The bag was removed. Romanov called VITYA PAN to report readiness. Panyushin gave instructions, which questions to ask, how to conduct the interrogation. He himself was in Kursk, in his apartment, formally uninvolved in the kidnapping. But he was directing the operation by phone, issuing clear commands. The interrogation began with simple questions. Who gave the order for the attacks? Who provides support? What are the plans? Kulik was silent, refusing to answer. Romanov then turned to physical coercion, first punches, then kicks. Then they took up bats. He was beaten methodically, with pauses to allow for reflection. After an hour, Kulik began to talk. He named several crime bosses from neighboring regions who were supposedly displeased with VITYA PAN's growing influence and wanted to weaken his position. He admitted he had received financial support to organize competition. He disclosed the details of plans, which business areas they intended to seize, which of Panyushin's people they planned to poach. The information was valuable. Over the phone, VITYA PAN gave the instruction: continue the interrogation. Extract every last detail. The torture resumed. He was beaten for several more hours until Kulik had told them absolutely everything he knew. By the end of the interrogation, he was in a semi-conscious state with multiple broken ribs, a fractured jaw, and internal bleeding. The question arose: what to do with the victim? To kill him? Too risky. The disappearance of a criminal authority would cause serious consequences and trigger a gang war. To release him? Dangerous. He might go to the police. VITYA PAN settled on a solution. Release him, but frighten him so thoroughly he would be afraid to open his mouth. Kulik was told simply,
If you say a single word to the cops, we will kill not only you, but your entire family. We know where your wife, your children, and your parents live. One wrong move, and everyone is dead. Kulik, bleeding and morally broken, nodded.
He was driven back to the city and dumped in an industrial zone. A few hours later, he was found and brought to hospital. The doctors recorded severe bodily harm and called the police. Kulik was questioned. Where did the injuries come from? He lied, claiming he had been attacked by unknown assailants who wanted to rob him. The police opened a robbery case, but the investigation hit a dead end. No leads, no witnesses, and the victim himself was barely saying anything. For several months, Kulik kept quiet, fearing retaliation. But the injuries were serious, requiring prolonged treatment and surgery. His psychological state deteriorated. Nightmares, panic attacks, depression. At some point, he understood he could no longer live with that burden. In the spring of 2016, Kulik came to the Kursk Regional Prosecutor's Office and told the whole truth. He indicated on a map the location where he had been held and tortured. He named names: Nikolai Romanov and 3 other perpetrators. He pointed to the organizer, Viktor Panyushin, who had directed the operation by telephone. The prosecutor's office launched an investigation. Operatives went to the location Kulik had indicated. The abandoned cowshed in the forest did indeed exist. Inside, they found traces of human presence: cigarette butts, bottles, remnants of rope. Forensic analysis was conducted. Traces of Kulik's DNA were found on the ropes. Evidence that he had genuinely been held there. Operational and investigative measures began. Nikolai Romanov was picked up quickly. He had not particularly been in hiding and felt safe. He resisted arrest but was restrained. During interrogation, he maintained his composure and denied involvement. But the evidence was serious. Kulik's testimony, forensic results, and recordings of telephone conversations with VITYA PAN. The other perpetrators were arrested within a month. One attempted to flee but was caught at the Ukrainian border. All denied guilt, but the investigation gathered evidence methodically. Confrontations with Kulik, forensic examinations, analysis of telephone connections. The most significant development came when the investigation reached VITYA PAN himself. Wiretapping of his phone yielded a wealth of information. Conversations with Romanov on the day of the kidnapping, in which the operational details were discussed. Instructions on which questions to ask Kulik. Discussion of the interrogation results. Everything recorded, everything documented. In June 2016, Viktor Panyushin was summoned for questioning as a witness. He came calmly, accompanied by his lawyer. During questioning, he was confident, giving brief responses. Yes, he was acquainted with Romanov. No, he knew nothing about the kidnapping. Telephone conversations? They discussed business, nothing criminal. Kulik? He had seen him a couple of times, but was not closely acquainted. The investigation was not yet in a position to arrest him. There was insufficient direct evidence. The recorded conversations could be interpreted in different ways. Additional evidence was needed: testimony from accomplices, documentary confirmation. VITYA PAN was made to understand. He was under the microscope, and it would be better not to leave the region. But Panyushin understood the essential point. The matter was serious, and it would not be easy to wriggle out. The investigation was digging deep, and might unearth not only the Kulik kidnapping, but everything else. The casinos, the fraud, the organized group. A decision had to be made. In parallel, a second kidnapping came to light. A certain businessman who owed a large sum to people connected to VITYA PAN filed a statement with the police. He, too, had been kidnapped, held for several days in a basement, beaten, and extorted for the debt plus interest. After he paid, he was released, but the psychological trauma remained. The investigation merged the two cases. A pattern emerged. Panyushin's gang regularly used kidnappings and torture to resolve conflicts and extort money. Other cases began to surface, ones that victims had never reported out of fear. By late 2016, investigators had tracked down the casinos in Belgorod. One of those arrested in connection with the kidnapping case, seeking to soften his sentence, began providing testimony about the group's other crimes. He described the gambling halls, the real estate schemes, and the structure of the organization. The investigation mounted a large-scale operation. Simultaneous raids were conducted in several cities. 3 casinos in Belgorod were shut down. Gaming equipment was seized and staff detained. Documents, financial records, and hard drives from surveillance cameras were confiscated. Searches were carried out at suspects' residences. Large sums of cash, forged documents, and weapons were found. VITYA PAN sensed the noose tightening. He was called in for questioning more and more frequently, and the questions were becoming increasingly specific. His lawyer warned him, the case was heading toward an arrest. Better to prepare. But Panyushin made a different decision. In the summer of 2017, he disappeared. On the morning of June 15, 2017, investigators arrived at his home with an arrest warrant. The apartment was empty. Neighbors said they had seen Panyushin the previous evening. He had driven away in a car with a suitcase. No one saw him after that. A federal wanted notice was issued, then an international one. Airports, railway stations, and border crossings were checked. No trace anywhere. VITYA PAN had evaporated. Along with him vanished Yaroslav Sokolov and Titov, his 2 closest associates. The remaining members of the gang were either already arrested or under investigation for other offenses. On May 14, 2020, the investigative committee announced the conclusion of the investigation. 19 people were charged with creation of a criminal community, organization of illegal gambling, fraud, kidnapping, and extortion. The main suspect, Viktor Panyushin, remained on the international wanted list. Trials of the arrested defendants commenced. Nikolai Romanov received 15 years of strict regime detention for kidnapping, torture, and participation in an organized criminal community. The others received between 8 and 12 years, depending on their role in the crimes. Defense lawyers filed appeals, but without success. The evidentiary base was too strong. Meanwhile, VITYA PAN was already living a new life. In Ukraine, under a different name, with a new passport. How he managed to obtain those documents is a separate story, full of mysteries and conjecture. Ukraine, late 2017. Viktor Panyushin, going by the name in his new passport, rents an apartment in one of Kiev's residential neighborhoods. Nothing remarkable, an ordinary 2-room flat in a panel block, one of thousands just like it. Neighbors see a quiet elderly man who nods in greeting but does not stop to chat. Ideal camouflage for a man on the run. Obtaining a Ukrainian passport was the key moment in his escape. According to the official version he offered when detained in Cyprus, the documents had been issued to him under the government witness protection program. But what exactly could Panyushin have told Ukrainian intelligence? What information was so valuable that it earned him not merely temporary shelter, but full citizenship with altered personal details? Insiders in law enforcement circles offer several versions. The first. Panyushin passed information to the Ukrainian SBU about Russian criminal structures operating on Ukrainian territory. Names, addresses, money laundering schemes, drug supply channels. In the late 2000s, Ukrainian intelligence was actively combating Russian criminal influence, and such information was worth its weight in gold. The second version is more prosaic. Corruption within Ukraine's migration services was a byword. For the right sum, almost any document could be obtained. VITYA PAN had access to the Obszczak, where millions were stored. Paying a few $100,000 for a passport and refugee status was entirely within his means. The third version: connections. The criminal worlds of Russia and Ukraine had been tightly intertwined since the 90s. Many Russian thieves-in-law had partners in Ukraine, ran joint operations, and divided spheres of influence. After 20 years as a thief-in-law, Panyushin had undoubtedly established contacts with Ukrainian crime bosses. Those connections may have helped him reach the right people in law enforcement and arrange the documents. In all likelihood, all three factors worked in combination: information plus money plus connections. The result? An official Ukrainian passport in another name with an altered date of birth. Effectively, a new identity. Viktor Panyushin had ceased to exist legally. A new person with a clean record had appeared. In his early time in Ukraine, VITYA PAN lived an extremely cautious existence. He did not meet with criminal authorities, took no part in criminal operations, and attracted no attention. He lived off money from the Obszczak, which was transferred to him through complex schemes. Formally, he was a refugee hiding from political persecution in Russia. Informally, a thief-in-law in forced exile. But he could not fully sever himself from his former life. The thief's status carries obligations. He needed to maintain contact with other thieves, participate in resolving important matters, and oversee the Obszczak. Panyushin did this remotely, through encrypted messaging apps, through trusted intermediaries, through rare personal meetings at safe locations. Management of his remaining operations in Russia he delegated to the treasurer known as Andriusha Kidalovo. This man had been in VITYA PAN's circle since the early 2000s and had proven himself reliable and methodical. He was responsible for the group's finances, kept track of income and expenses, and distributed money from the Obszczak. After Panyushin's flight, Andriusha effectively became the interim overseer of Kursk Oblast. He did not hold the status of thief-in-law, but acted in VITYA PAN's name, invoking his authority. He collected contributions from the remaining criminal enterprises, resolved day-to-day issues, and maintained thieves' traditions. But power corrupts. Gradually, Andriusha began using his position for personal gain. A portion of the Obszczak money settled into his own pockets. He invested in his own businesses, bought real estate through front people, and transferred funds abroad. Formally, everything ran to plan, but in reality the Obszczak was dwindling. Rumors about Andriusha's financial manipulation reached VITYA PAN. On several occasions he tried to get to the bottom of it, demanded reports, and checked the figures. But it is difficult to exercise control over events in Russia from Ukraine. Andriusha invariably had an explanation: hard times, comrades arrested, money needed for lawyers and supporting those inside. The figures added up on paper, though reality was otherwise. By 2019, the situation had sharpened. In Russia, several of VITYA PAN's associates who had previously evaded justice were arrested. The investigation kept digging, gathering new evidence, and most significantly, Article 210.1 was introduced into the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, occupying the highest position in the criminal hierarchy. This article marked a turning point for the entire thieves' world in Russia. Previously, to imprison a thief-in-law, specific crimes had to be proven: murder, extortion, the creation of an organized criminal community. Now it was sufficient to prove the mere fact of holding that status. And the punishment? From 8 to 15 years of imprisonment. For investigators, this simplified matters enormously. No need to gather complex evidence of individual crimes. Witness testimony that a person is a thief-in-law, wiretap recordings in which he identifies himself as such or is addressed that way, and financial documents showing a connection to the Obszczak. That was enough. Many thieves made the investigators' work easier by openly advertising their status. This article became the decisive moment for the entire thieves' world in Russia. Many thieves-in-law departed the country. With the legal situation changed, VITYA PAN's position became far more precarious. The arrest, extradition, and trial. December 21, 2023. Sheremetyevo Airport, Moscow. A flight from Istanbul lands in the early morning. Among the passengers, under escort by Turkish and Russian security officers, is a 65-year-old man in handcuffs. Viktor Panyushin returns to his homeland after 7 years on the run. At the foot of the gangway, a group of Russian Interior Ministry operatives meets him. The transfer procedure takes a few minutes, signing documents, handing over personal belongings, removing the Turkish handcuffs and replacing them with Russian ones. One of the operatives turns on a camera and records the moment for the official record, and asks the question that will become the key evidence in the case. Do you acknowledge yourself to be a thief-in-law? Panyushin looks into the camera. A pause of several seconds. He could have refused to answer, citing his right to remain silent until he could speak with a lawyer. But he replies, "Yes, I acknowledge it." Those 3 words seal his fate. Under Article 210.1 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, acknowledging one's status is direct proof of guilt. There is no need to prove specific crimes or gather complex evidence. The person himself has acknowledged occupying the highest position in the criminal hierarchy. That is sufficient for a conviction. Why did he confess? Psychologists suggest several reasons. Exhaustion after long months in prison, the stress of extradition, the realization that punishment was inevitable. Perhaps a thief's pride came into play, not to renounce one's status even in the face of justice. Or perhaps he simply did not understand the legal consequences of his words. He is brought to Kursk, where a criminal case has been awaiting him for several years. He is placed in pre-trial detention facility number 1 in a single occupancy cell, given his status and age. A lawyer is appointed, interrogations begin, and investigative procedures are initiated. The investigation resumes its work on the case, now with the main defendant in custody. Charges under Article 210.1 are officially brought, plus additional charges: creation of a criminal community, organization of illegal gambling, fraud, kidnapping, and extortion. The combined sentence could be up to 25 years of deprivation of liberty. At his age, this is effectively a life sentence. The lawyers begin constructing a defense. Their strategy? To challenge the airport confession. They argue that Panyushin was in a state of stress, did not understand the significance of the question, was misled. The confession was obtained in violation of procedure. No lawyer was present, no warning of the right to remain silent. The prosecution counters. The video recording clearly shows that Panyushin was of sound mind, understood the question, and answered voluntarily. No violence or threats were applied. The confession is lawful and may be used as evidence. In parallel, additional evidence of his status is gathered. Witnesses from the criminal world are summoned who confirm Panyushin's coronation in 2000. Recordings of intercepted telephone calls are examined, in which he is addressed as a thief-in-law. Financial flows are analyzed, the movement of money into the Obszczak, and contributions from criminal enterprises. For the other episodes, kidnappings, casinos, fraud, testimony is gathered from victims and accomplices. Kulik gives detailed testimony about the torture in the forest. The businessman describes the extortion. Casino staff describe how the underground halls were run. Victims of real estate fraud provide documentation. But then something unexpected happens. The Kursk Regional Court returns the case to the prosecutor. The reason? procedural violations discovered in the materials. The court does not disclose specifics, but this is a serious blow to the prosecution. Procedural violations can lead to evidence being ruled inadmissible, which in turn can cause the entire case to collapse. VITYA PAN's lawyers are jubilant. This is their small victory. The prosecution is compelled to correct errors, refile documents, and re-interview witnesses. The process drags on for months. Panyushin remains in custody, but hope emerges for a lighter sentence or even a collapsed case. And then, 7 months after the triumphant airport confession, an event occurs that shocks all parties to the proceedings. July 2024, the Kursk Regional Court. A separate criminal case is being heard in which Viktor Panyushin appears as a witness. He is called into the courtroom. Panyushin enters calmly as always, an intellectual man in a neat suit. He is sworn in and asked to give testimony. And then he utters a phrase that makes the prosecutor's jaws drop. "I have no connection whatsoever to the criminal world." A silence falls over the courtroom. The man who 7 months ago openly acknowledged himself as a thief-in-law, who spent half his life in prison, who had been tried 9 times for serious crimes, who had led an organized criminal group, engaged in extortion, kidnapping, and torture. This man declares he has no connection to crime? The prosecutor tries to clarify. "Are you denying your status as a thief-in-law?" Panyushin replies with equanimity. "I was never a thief-in-law. That is slander and the invention of ill-wishers." The defense lawyers immediately take the floor. They declare that Panyushin's airport confession was made under duress, that he did not understand the significance of the question, that he had been intimidated, that he was in a state of stress after the long extradition. Now, in a calm setting, he is providing truthful testimony. The prosecution is in shock. The airport video recording is the cornerstone of the Article 210.1 charge. But now, Panyushin himself is denying what he said on video. A legal paradox is created. The court must determine which statements to treat as true, those given in December 2023 or those given in July 2024. Legal experts explain the defense's strategy. The lawyers are attempting to create doubt. If the court can be persuaded that the confession was coerced and that Panyushin's true position is one of denial, the evidentiary basis for the Article 210.1 charge will be weakened. Of course, there remains witness testimony, wiretap recordings, and circumstantial evidence. But there will no longer be a direct confession. Psychologists point to another aspect. VITYA PAN has played roles all his life: an intellectual for ordinary people, a crime boss for the criminal world, a victim of political persecution for the Ukrainian authorities. One more role, an innocent man before a Russian court, is entirely in keeping with his character. But there is a third version. Panyushin may genuinely have experienced a psychological break. 7 months in a pretrial detention facility, the realization of an inevitable long sentence, age 65. All of this could have affected his mental state. Denial of reality as a defense mechanism. A man unable to accept that his life is over begins to convince both himself and others that he is innocent. Whatever the truth, the case has taken a new turn. The prosecution is compelled to furnish additional proof of Panyushin's status as a thief-in-law. New witnesses from the criminal world are called, who confirm the 2000 coronation. Operational wiretap materials are examined, in which Panyushin is addressed as a thief. Financial flows into the Obshchak are analyzed, providing indirect confirmation of his position in the hierarchy. In parallel, investigations of the other episodes continue: casino organization, real estate fraud, kidnappings. For these charges, Denial of thief-in-law status is irrelevant. There are specific crimes with evidence to support them. The trial continues. Panyushin is held in the Kursk pretrial detention facility. His health is deteriorating. Age is taking its toll. Defense lawyers file motions to change the restraint measure to house arrest, but the court refuses. Too high a risk of flight, given his previous record. In criminal circles, VITYA PAN's fate is the subject of discussion. Some thieves consider him a traitor for having fled and left his people to face arrest. Others condemn him for acknowledging his status at the airport. By the Thieves' Code, one must never admit one's status to the police, even when it is obvious. A third group sympathizes. He overplayed his hand, they say, but he's holding himself with dignity. The story of VITYA PAN is becoming a symbol of the end of an era. The introduction of Article 210.1 has genuinely changed the life of thieves-in-law in Russia. Where once it was difficult to prove membership in an organized criminal community, specific crimes had to be established. Now, proving the status itself is sufficient. And thieves have been leaving the country in large numbers. According to Interior Ministry estimates, between 2019 and 2024, approximately 50 thieves-in-law and several hundred associated crime bosses left Russia. The geography of their flight is vast. Ukraine, until 2022, Georgia, Turkey, the UAE, Germany, Spain, Israel. Some have legalized their status, opened businesses, and live quietly. Others continue criminal activity in their new locations. Still others, like VITYA PAN, are caught sooner or later and extradited. Experts compare the Russian experience with that of Georgia. In Georgia, the fight against thieves-in-law began earlier and was even more severe. Criminal liability was introduced not only for occupying the highest position, but even for mere membership in the thieves' world. Georgian thieves fled en masse to Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. Authorities confiscated property and handed down lengthy sentences with no possibility of early release. The criminal milieu was dismantled. Russia took a similar path, but more softly. Article 210.1 is a warning. The state is signaling, the thieves' world will no longer be tolerated. Either leave voluntarily, or you will be imprisoned. And many chose to leave. VITYA PAN did not leave in time. He tried, but failed. And now he has become an example to others. This is what happens when you try to play against the state and lose. At the time this story was written, the case of Viktor Panyushin was still being heard in the Kursk Regional Court. The prosecution is pressing for the maximum sentence under Article 210.1, 15 years of deprivation of liberty, plus additional terms for the other episodes. In total, Panyushin faces up to 25 years in a strict regime penal colony. At his age, this is effectively life imprisonment. Defense lawyers are fighting for mitigation, citing their client's age, poor health, and the argument that many of the charges rest on the testimony of interested parties. They ask the court to take into account that Panyushin never personally committed acts of violence, but only gave the orders. But the chances of an acquittal or a lenient sentence are minimal. VITYA PAN himself maintains his composure. At court sessions, he is calm, answers questions clearly, and shows no emotion. The intellectual mask does not slip even here. But those who have seen him up close note, his eyes give him away. Fatigue, an awareness of the end. What lies ahead for VITYA PAN? Most likely a conviction and a lengthy sentence, a strict regime colony somewhere in a remote region. Years behind bars, a reality he knows well from having spent the better part of his life there. But now, this is not a temporary stopover between criminal jobs. It is the finale. In a few years, perhaps, there will be rumors of his death in the colony, or that he is gravely ill and has been transferred to a prison hospital. Or, on the contrary, that he has improbably survived and, even in his 70s, retains authority among inmates, still settles matters by the code, reads books, and holds intellectual conversations. Or perhaps an unexpected turn will occur, a sudden release on amnesty, a prisoner exchange, political maneuvering at the highest level. In Russian reality, anything is possible. But one thing can be said with certainty. The story of VITYA PAN has become a vivid illustration of how the state changes the rules of the game. The thieves' world, which for decades had existed in parallel with official power, with its own laws, hierarchy, and obshchaks, is now in the crosshairs. The state has decided it will no longer tolerate competitors in the matter of the monopoly on violence and governance. The era of thieves-in-law in Russia is drawing to a close. VITYA PAN is one of the last representatives of a departing generation. Young people no longer aspire to the thieves' world. There is none of the romance that existed in the 90s. Today, it is simply a path to prison with minimal prospects. And yet the story of the intellectual thief from Almatyevsk, who traveled from petty criminal to overseer of 3 regions, spent 7 years hiding across 4 countries, and was ultimately caught due to an elementary passport error at a hotel. This story is worth telling. Not to romanticize crime, but as a lesson that every criminal career, sooner or later, ends the same way. Behind bars, or in a grave. Viktor Mikhailovich Panyushin, thief-in-law VITYA PAN, overseer of Kursk, Oryol, and Belgorod oblasts. A man who might have become a university lecturer or a doctor, but chose a different path. A man who spent more time behind bars than at liberty, yet returned to crime every time. A man who at 65 sits in a pre-trial detention facility and denies the obvious, that his whole life he was part of the thieves' world. His story is the story of an entire generation. A generation born in the USSR that came of age in the chaos of the 90s, reached its heights in the 2000s, and found itself redundant in the 2000s. The state changed. The rules changed. And VITYA PAN remained in the past, unable to adapt to the new reality. Perhaps in 20 years someone will write a book about him, or make a film. The intellectual thief, the man of paradoxes, the last of the Mohicans of the criminal world. The script is written, the protagonist is colorful, and the plot twists are gripping. For now, he sits in a cell in the Kursk pre-trial detention facility, reads his books, the habit endures, awaits trial, and thinks about where he went wrong. Perhaps he should not have returned to that hotel in Cyprus. Perhaps he should not have acknowledged his status at the airport. Perhaps he should never have entered the criminal world at 19. But history does not deal in the subjunctive. What is done is done. The path was chosen, walked to its end, and now all that remains is to pay the price. VITYA PAN, the intellectual thief. The man who was hunted for 7 years across 4 countries. The man who confessed and then recanted. The man whose fate became a symbol of the end of an entire era in Russian criminal history. And when, many years from now, someone studies the history of organized crime in early 21st century Russia, the name of Viktor Panyushin will inevitably surface in documents, case files, and memoirs, as an example of what the path of a thief-in-law leads to in an era when the state decided to put an end to parallel power structures. The end of an era. The end of a road. VITYA PAN's last flight to Moscow was truly his last. There will be no more flights. Only years behind bars in anticipation of the inevitable finale. Viktor Panyushin, VITYA PAN, intellectual thief, man of paradoxes. His story will end with a court verdict, but the memory of it will endure as a lesson. In the criminal world, as in any other, sooner or later, the bill always comes due.